I now would like to introduce this morning's presenter. Jessie Fullenkamp is Director of Mental Health at the Ruth Ellis Center. Jessie joined the Ruth Ellis team in October of 2010. She has led the development and implementation of a variety of programs with LGBTQ youth of color experiencing homelessness or that are in care. At the Ruth Ellis Center, these services include mental health, leadership, advocacy, transgender health, street outreach, family acceptance, and preservation. Jessie has been instrumental in implementing positive youth development, harm reduction, transformative justice, and trauma-informed care at the agency. She studied in Kumasi, Ghana, and graduated with a BSW from Xavier University of Cincinnati, Ohio, and an MSW from the University of Michigan. Jessie lived and worked in the Federated States of Micronesia on the island of Wano on projects pertaining to education, HIV, and women's issues. She is now a proud Detroiter and a member of the Detroit Radical Social Workers. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ms. Jessie Fullenkamp.
I just want to take a second to thank Pat and BCE. They've been so supportive in this work. This is not easy work to support for a lot of different reasons. And so just know that they're here as a resource on top of the information that I'm sharing today, and feel free to utilize them. So again, I'm Jessie Fullenkamp, and I work with the Ruth Ellis Center. And we'll talk more at the end of the presentation about the resources of the Ruth Ellis Center. But we are an organization that work with youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning. And for the purposes of the presentation today, I'm going to use the acronym LGBTQ, so I don't have to keep saying that over and over again. But a lot of times people ask, well, what's the right acronym to use? And we say, don't get caught up in being PC or worried about that. Just listen to what people are using around you and what is a good fit for your community. So we use LGBTQ, and we can talk more about that later. So again, in introducing myself, I also want to share that I use the gender pronouns she and her, and we'll talk about that more later as well. But this work is incredibly important to me. My colleagues always send me to do things like this, and they joke around because they say that I'm really good at acting straight, and, which is an inappropriate thing to say, by the way. But we joke about this because a lot of us at the agency identify as LGBTQ, and so this work is important to us on a professional level, but it's also important to us on a personal level. So we'll talk about kind of what that means for us as professionals today, and understanding that professional and personal boundary and understanding. But as an LGBTQ person, I have done work in Kumasi, Ghana with youth who identify as LGBTQ, and in the Federated States of Micronesia, which is a tiny island country in the middle of the Pacific Islands. I've also done this work in Cincinnati, and for the most part here in Detroit, Michigan. And what has been incredibly interesting is how similar this work can look, and how important it is no matter where I've been. So just starting with that. So we're going to look today at our objectives, and in your folders you have the PowerPoint presentation. That might be an incredibly helpful tool today as we take notes. And some of this information that's a little bit more basic, we're going to go through more quickly. So I really encourage folks, if you have questions or looking for more resources, to also at the end of the day defer to this packet that has more in-depth definitions for you to take with you in case there are questions that are not answered. But we will leave some time at the end of the presentation today for Q&A. So the objectives of this presentation. I used to be a teacher, so I really like people to know what they're going to get out of something before we do it. But I also share these to kind of set up expectations or guidelines, again, for us to think about this in terms of our professional identity. So we're first and foremost talking about understanding your role in working with LGBTQ youth in care. And so when we do this presentation, a lot of people say, oh, well, we don't have gay kids at our agency, but I guess this is a good training to come to. And I always ask, oh, do you work with less than 10 people? and they'll give me a weird look, right? And we say that to say that we know that as many as 1 in 10 people identify as LGBTQ. So you might not think that the youth or individuals that you serve identify as LGBTQ, but they're there. They're there at your agency, we're there at your agency. And so whether you are wanting to do this work or not, it's a part of the work that you do. So first and foremost, this is all of our roles. And second, that the goal today is to increase our knowledge for the need of affirming services. So a lot of times people will ask, well, why is this really that important? We don't hate gay people at our agency, so we've got it. And so we're really going to kind of dive into what are some of the special needs that the LGBTQ youth community has, and how can we do a better job at addressing those needs. Third, we're going to check some of our assumptions that we have. And when we talk about assumptions, it's important to know that people shouldn't feel guilty for making assumptions about people that we work with or having been raised with different ideas. It's just important that we own those things and that we understand how those affect our lens of the work. Then we'll also talk about best practices and leave with referral resources. So let's look at our role. So when we talk about our role, again, first and foremost, this is about providing quality services. So I doubt that anybody is in this room right now because their job pays a ton of money, right? We're all in this field because we care about working with folks who, for a variety of reasons, have been disadvantaged, have been discriminated against, and don't have as many resources, right? So what we're talking about today is how to provide better services and how to ensure the health and safety of youth in care. This is really about the health and safety of youth in care. So we're not going to talk today about how you vote or what your personal beliefs are. We're talking about how to provide the most quality services for LGBTQ youth in care. And then we're also looking at directives from the NASW, from the American Psychological Association, and the American Medical Association. So these aren't things that the Ruth Ellis Center as this rogue agency is making up out of Highland Park. These are best practices that national organizations that we all affiliate with to a certain extent have said are important. So we're now going to look at 3 reasons to start off with to better understand why is there focus on LGBTQ youth. And this is an important question because a lot of times, even though I identify as LGBTQ, when I heard about the Ruth Ellis Center, I was kind of surprised that there was an entire agency solely dedicated to working with LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness or in foster care. I thought, wow, they must have like 5 kids that go there. And I had no idea how many youth were accessing services, right? So last year alone, we had over 500 unique contacts, and we had over 5,250 service contacts. So to start off with, this is a large community, right? This is not some kind of rare, unique thing that we're never going to see. And then particularly in social services and foster care, this is even a larger community because of the challenges and lack of support that young people have in other areas or other institutions. So when LGBTQ youth come to you for services, it's often because they're not getting those services through their family or that support through their family or through their school or through their faith community or through their social groups. So your role in this is extremely vital. So the first reason that we're looking at why the importance of this work exists is first talking about social identity. So when we say social identity, we're talking about ways that people identify that society has put onto us, things that we don't get to choose. So other examples of social identity include race, class, ability, and ability not just being physical, but also mental and emotional. Biological sex, age, nationality, ethnicity, religion, and culture. So again, these are aspects of our identity that often society will attribute labels to us. We don't get to choose those labels, and there are implications tied to these labels. So there's often power or privilege that might come from some of these social identities, but there's also oppression and discrimination that can come from these social identities. And so the first reason that the importance of focusing on LGBTQ youth exists is that sexual orientation and gender identity are also social identities, right? So we can all think of organizations that exist that focus on specific social identities. There are often women's centers to help better serve the needs of women. There are often Black student associations to better serve the needs of students of color. There are often groups based on language or ethnicity to affirm and support that community. So in the same way that we understand the purpose and need for groups for other social identities, that is true for LGBTQ folks as well. So we are going to, in the spirit of dialectic learning, do an activity right now where I'm going to ask you to, if you're comfortable, turn to the person next to you and share. If you're not comfortable with that, or if you're more of an introvert and process better by writing, you can think to yourself and write. But we're going to examine 4 questions here that are on the screen. And I'm going to go through them briefly and just give some examples of possible answers that someone might share. So the first question is, what social identity is important to your sense of self? And for this question, we're going to ask that you pick just one social identity, which is a problematic thing to ask, right? Because we all have a lot of social identities that are important to our sense of self. But for the purposes of this activity, we're going to ask you to choose one. And again, the social identities that we're kind of talking about are race, class, ability, biological sex, age, nationality, ethnicity, religion, and culture. So for this question, I would answer that identifying as a woman is very important to my sense of self. The second question is, as an adolescent, and for some of us that might take a second to think about and remember, that's okay, what examples, resources, and support did you have to affirm this social identity? So for this response, I would share that growing up, I had a lot of role models who identified as women, who were making positive, healthy choices, who also were leading very different kinds of lives, right? So I had women in my life who were raising families and working really hard from the home. I had women who were examples of people who decided not to have children and were working really hard in the workplace. I had examples of women who were doing both, and so I had a diverse representation of this social identity in my life. Third, in what ways does your work affirm the social identities of adolescent consumers? And this question is about the work of your agency. So you all are doing phenomenal work, very important work at your agencies. And there might be a specialization or social identity that either your agency is mission specific to or happens to show up at your agency. And so which social identity do you think your agency is particularly good at serving, right? And at the Ruth Ellis Center, a majority of the youth who come to our space identify as African American. We're located in Highland Park, and so a lot of the programming that we do is African-centric and talks about affirming African identity. So that is a part of the work that we do at Ruth Ellis Center. And then the fourth question is, how can you include or do more to affirm LGBTQ youth in your work? So your agency might already be doing a few things, or you might not be doing anything that you're aware of right now, but thinking about affirming social identities in your workplace, what are some extra steps that you could take to make that happen? So we're going to take 4 minutes right now, and if you're sharing with a partner, we'll ask that you take 2 minutes for one person to share your answers to these questions, and then switch, and the other partner can take 2 minutes to share your answers to this question. And if you're writing to yourself, then you can be more reflective and take the whole 4 minutes for yourself. So let's go ahead and partner up. And at the virtual sites, if you're able to find a partner, if you're looking for a partner, you can raise your hand and maybe do some minimal moving around. But the clock has started. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up. Finish our sharing. I would love to hear people's responses. It sounds like there were some incredibly rich conversations, but we wanted to have these conversations and again kind of step back and think about what's at the core of what builds good relationships, what's at the core of what helps young people feel comfortable, have a strong sense of self, right? And so regardless of how we identify, there are common themes that we know of that are true for any social identity, right? So looking at the second reason that we do a focus on LGBTQ youth is related to the developmental needs of children. And so this is an area that I know you all have a lot of expertise around. You are paying attention to different developmental cues as it relates to physical health. Certainly you're looking at different developmental cues with social, psycho-emotional pieces. So again, there are things that apply to all youth, but then when you look at that with the lens of what that means for the needs of LGBTQ youth, this helps us go a little bit deeper with what do services look like and why is there a special need for this focus. So first we're talking about, again, the need for a positive sense of self-concept, and the good feelings about oneself, self-esteem. And I'm sure that in your conversations or in your reflection just now, you're able to identify that having role models, having resources that affirm who you are and that help you to be safe and healthy in who you are very key to this piece. Second is about the need to feel safe expressing emotions. So unfortunately, society often tells us that if you identify a certain way, you shouldn't share your emotions, right? That you shouldn't talk about how you feel. But I would imagine that as community mental health professionals and social workers, you are the person at Thanksgiving with your family saying, we need to talk about this, right? So when we think about the need to feel safe expressing emotions, that isn't just about how did you feel about typical experiences, but also how did you feel being your authentic self and sharing those experiences. And then the third piece, thinking about child development, that's especially important to think about for LGBTQ youth, is the need for an attachment to a caregiver. And so I'm sure that you all have spent a lot of time thinking about attachment theory and what that looks like. And we know that for youth in foster care, there's a lot of extra barriers to attachment, having an attachment to a caregiver when there's a disruption in the family, which is why family preservation and reunification is such an important key to our work, right? But if you take that a step further and think about what does attachment look like for LGBTQ youth when they might be experiencing rejection from their parents or their primary caregivers, we know that this can lead to a lot of negative health outcomes. So insecure attachments are related to all kinds of issues throughout life. So if we understand that, then we understand the need for LGBTQ youth to have primary caregivers or parents who affirm their identity. And so that oftentimes can be people who are working in foster care as well. Ideally it's not, ideally it's parents or a permanent person, but sometimes we are the closest person to offer that in care. So we're going to now examine 3 more questions. And again, these are questions that you can think about to yourself or share in pairs. And these are more related to development. So the first question is, as an adolescent, did you feel safe sharing your emotions and or being authentic? Why or why not? So for this question, an example that I would share is that for as much as I felt affirmed being a woman growing up, and I lived in a community where a lot of people looked like me, a lot of people had similar resources, everybody was Catholic like I was, that I didn't feel safe being my whole self. So because a lot of my key supports existed in a faith community, and this is not to say that all faith communities are unsafe for LGBTQ folks, but my particular faith community that I grew up with was very unsafe for LGBTQ folks. And so growing up, I knew that I could never, never, never share with my youth minister or my priest or any of my friends that I would go on retreats with or go to CCD with that I liked girls, right? In fact, I'm horrified at the thought that my youth minister would see this video and know that I work at an LGBTQ organization to this day, right? I'm very confident, I have a lot of support in my life, but growing up, the fear of being outed to that community was so strong that it still stays with me, right? So I absolutely did not feel safe being my whole self, felt a lot of shame, utilized a lot of self-harm behaviors when I felt ashamed of who I was, especially after being at church. So the second question then goes into how did this dynamic affect your attachment to caring adults? So obviously, having trust issues, not feeling like I could be authentic was hugely detrimental to my ability to go deeper and to deal with kind of, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of need, if I didn't feel safe, I wasn't going to get to go deeper on a lot of other levels, and especially not my relationships with caring adults. And then the third question asks, name examples of how we can support healthy attachments to caring adults for LGBTQ youth in care. And so at the Ruth Ellis Center, a lot of these tools are tools that, again, you all know and utilize: unconditional positive regard, supportive systems and structures, but again, making sure that we don't have double standards related to sexual orientation or gender identity is a big part of the work that we do in our residential foster care facility. So now if you can take 3 minutes, so that will be 1.5 minutes each for a partner to share, and then we'll switch. Or if you'd like to take 3 minutes to yourself to think about these questions, and then we'll come back together. So again, when we talk about attachment, these are not new concepts to you all as social workers, as mental health providers. People are still sharing this is good, right? This is information that resonates with us because these are things that we've been taught as professionals. These are tools that we utilize with a lot of different youth and families and understand. So again, we just encourage you to think about how do these theories, how are things that we already know and understand apply to LGBTQ youth. With attachment in particular, most attachment can be applied in ways that it's not heteronormative, or not specific to a two-parent household, but I will encourage you to think about what are the implications when there's literature about attachment theory talking about maternal attachment, because while that's all very helpful and relevant information, that does assume that the child has a mom, right? So there are children that grow up with single dads, there are children that grow up with two dads. And we know that attachment is just as important for those children, but that some of the literature related to maternal attachment might not be as relevant, and that's assuming that the child has a mom, right? So we just always want to think about what are some of the assumptions sometimes based on this information and making sure that we are unpacking that. So we're going to look at the third reason now for why the focus on LGBTQ youth. And the final piece of this is really just about statistics, right? When it comes down to, we're talking about health and safety. So we talk about better serving LGBTQ youth because there are serious health and safety risks of not doing that. So a lot of times you hear about what do stats look like for LGBTQ youth compared to their straight counterparts, right? But instead of using that premise, what we want to look at is what do statistics look like if you take two LGBTQ kids, so let's say you take two youth who identify as gay, and all things are equal in terms of social identity, race, class, everything, right? And one of them is raised in an affirming foster care home. And one of them is raised in a rejecting foster care home. And when I say affirming and rejecting, we're talking about how the primary caregivers view that child's identity as gay, right? And so there's been a study done by Dr. Caitlin Ryan out of California, primarily with Latina and white families who have children who identify as LGBTQ. And the body of literature that they've developed and the data is startling because what we're finding is that what is a huge determinant in the health and safety of LGBTQ youth is not just being gay, right? It's what does the rejection and affirming behaviors look like in the household. So if you, again, take a rejecting household and an affirming household, all things equal, the household that has rejecting behaviors, the foster home that has rejecting behaviors, drastically increases the child's risk of committing suicide, experiencing depression, contracting HIV and STIs, and using illegal drugs. So those were the 4 health outcomes that they focused on for this study to kind of hone the behaviors. And more specifically, with the suicide stat, a child in a rejecting home is more than 8 times likely to commit suicide compared to a child in an affirming home, right? So again, this is not about what we believe about if being gay is right or wrong. This is about protecting children and keeping them safe, right? So if we know that telling the child that we believe you know who you are, we love you for who you are, we support you for who you are, that you are drastically decreasing that child's chances of committing suicide. And then related to illegal drug use and contracting HIV and STIs, the chances are more than 3 times likely in a rejecting household. So while this information, for those of us who have done this work for a while, this is not surprising information, but this is an important thing to note because, again, it's going back to the basic health and safety questions. It moves us away from what people should believe or what's right or wrong to really basic questions about how to keep children, especially children in care, safe and healthy, right? Just some other statistics that are especially valid to the work of Ruth Ellis Center. A lot of the youth that we work with are experiencing homelessness. And we know that nationwide, 4 out of 10, as many as 4 out of 10 youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. So if you look at an LGBTQ child compared to their straight counterpart, they're more likely to experience homelessness. And this is related to family rejection and kids being kicked out. So we are now going to move into some brief best practices around language and LGBTQ 101. And for those of you who feel more comfortable with this, I encourage you to kind of think about Bloom's taxonomy in your learning. So if you're able to identify this information, if this is not new to you, awesome. Kind of think about how you can take this information to the next level. How can you analyze this, compare it, evaluate it within your own agency and how it's being utilized. And the framework that I'm going to present to you is not the be-all, end-all framework. It's the framework that we utilize at the Ruth Ellis Center. It's a framework that comes out of a lot of the work at University of Michigan's intergroup relations and what they do. But there are other models that people might see that are also helpful, but this is one that we use. So we're first going to look at 10 pictures on the slideshow. So if everyone's able to look at the PowerPoint, I'm going to show you 10 pictures of people. And I want you to imagine that these are individuals that come to your agency for services, right? And as I go through the pictures, I want folks silently to think to themselves, what are your first assumptions about these people, especially as it relates to their biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, right? So I'm going to show you the pictures for just like 10 seconds each and note what your assumptions are as you see the picture. So picture 1. Picture 2. Picture 3. Picture 4. Picture 5. Picture 6. Picture 7. Picture 8. Picture 9. And picture 10. So there's one answer to every picture, what we know about every picture, and the answer is that we don't know anything about these people. That's the answer to every single picture. And it's important to note that it's human nature to say, oh, they probably identify as a woman, or oh, they probably identify as gay. Our brains like to know what's going on, right? To put things in different boxes. And so instead of feeling bad about that, we want you to recognize that our brains are doing that that's what's happening, but that to do this work effectively, we need to never make an assumption about somebody. And this is true in relation to a lot of different social identities. And I'm sure that people here have had experiences, maybe not related to gender identity, biological sex, or sexual orientation, where people have heard your accent and been like, I know where you're from, I can tell where you're from, or they look at you and they're like, where are you from? Or I know where you're from, right? So we know what this feels like when people make assumptions about us, and that can be hurtful. But it also is just a huge waste of time when you think about doing intake and social work. The importance of finding appropriate ways in the right environment to ask people about identity is very key. And so really the takeaway of what we're getting ready to talk about is, at the end of the day, don't make assumptions. Right? And just because you know one thing about a person doesn't mean that you know other things about them. And that the only way that you can really know is by that person self-identifying or sharing that information with you. So we're going to now talk about 4 different aspects of social identity that are especially relevant to sexual orientation, gender expression, and identity. So the first one we're going to talk about is biological sex. And when we talk about biological sex, when we ask about biological sex, we're talking about people's physical body, so their internal and external reproductive organs, their hormone levels, chromosomes, and sexual characteristics. And this is a really important function of our work, right? There are a lot of decisions made based on someone's biological sex, right? So their entire facility is built on children who identify as males, right? Their entire facility is based on children who identify as females. So our biological sex alone determines a lot in our lives, right? And it definitely determines a lot of services, and it determines a lot of assumptions that we make about what services are going to be best, right? So words that we use to identify biological sex are female, male, transsexual, questioning, transitioning, and intersex. I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about gender identity. So gender identity, it's very, very important. If you remember one thing from this presentation, please remember that biological sex and gender identity are not the same thing, right? And if you think that, you're not alone. Most people think that because we use gender and sex interchangeably all the time. We assume that they're synonymous, but they're not. Gender identity is how a person in their heart, mind, and soul understand their gender identity. And words that we use to define gender identity include girl, woman, boy, man, transgender, genderqueer, questioning, fluid, and none. So the last time you had to fill out a form, I'm sure that there's a good chance they asked you what your gender is, and the options were male, female, right? Which is actually not accurate. We assume that they're one and the same because for about 97% of the population, that is true. But for about 3% of the population, they might be born male, but identify as a girl. They might have been born female, but identify as a boy, right? So we cannot always know. What is the first thing when a baby's born that we often ask about the baby? Is it a boy or a girl? What is it? Can we actually know if the baby is a boy or a girl? If we're using the English language accurately. We can know the biological sex, right? So we're actually wondering, is the boy male, or is the baby male or female? But we cannot know if the baby is a boy or a girl. At what point do we know how that child identifies? As the child develops and once they can speak and share that with you, right? So we cannot actually know if it's a boy or a girl. The entire stork, business is totally inaccurate, right? We're actually asking about biological sex, which is interesting because that's incredibly personal, right? Does your baby have a penis or a vagina? That's what people are asking, right? I would say it's none of your business, right? And certainly we never talk about if a baby's born intersex because that is something that, because it's more ambiguous, makes us very uncomfortable. But the reality is that most babies who are born intersex are born healthy. So, you always hear the line where parents always say, well, I just want my baby to be healthy, right? Like, okay, so what are you trying to say here? But that's actually a really great cliche. I want my baby to be healthy. So this is important to note because, again, for youth who identify as transgender, that means that their biological sex and their gender identity do not match according to what society expects them to, right? And so for people who do not identify as transgender, this is often a really difficult thing to understand. Even for those of us who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, we often do not understand or have the tools to understand what it means to identify as transgender. So just one example that is not exact, but might be kind of helpful is Angelina Jolie, actually. So Angelina Jolie last year was in the news. Does anyone remember why? She had a double mastectomy, right? So she had both of her breasts removed because she found out that there was a good chance she might have breast cancer, right? So once she had both of her breasts removed, the second she had her breasts removed, which was an altercation to her biological sex, did that mean that she stopped identifying as a woman? No. Her gender identity was intact because it's something that she understands internally. She did have immediate implants right away, right? Because society's expectation is if you identify as a woman, you should have breasts. And for Angelina Jolie in particular, the expectation is that your body is very sexualized and you have large breasts, right? Or might have been Brad Pitt's expectation, right? So, but this is important to note. This is an important example of how our gender identity is intact independently from our bodies. And for most of us, because we have fit what society expects of us, that's an easy thing. We've never had to think about it before. But for people who identify as transgender, they often don't feel like themselves in their bodies, right? So another important thing to mention as it pertains to youth in foster care who are transgender is that just because someone identifies as transgender does not mean that they are going to or want to go on hormone therapy or have surgery. And for the youth that we work with, oftentimes having surgery is not attainable. It's not affordable. So we have to think about what are ways that we can support youth in care's gender identity as people without as many resources and what that looks like as well. So this isn't just a conversation about gender identity, it's about what does the intersection of class look like as well. So next we're going to talk about gender expression. And again, gender expression is often conflated with gender identity. We assume that if someone identifies as a woman, that we know how she's going to speak and dress and act, right? But again, gender expression is independent of these other identities. So when we talk about gender expression, we're talking about how one demonstrates their gender based on traditional or non-traditional gender roles, dress, body language, voice, behavior, social interactions, or other indicators. So words that we use to explain gender expression include feminine, masculine, androgynous, fluid, genderqueer, or questioning. And for most people, it's very rare that someone is totally masculine in everything that they do, right? Or that someone's completely feminine in everything that they do. So most people within a certain range express some different kind of gender expression, right? But again, we conflate this with gender identity a lot. So if you go to the store and you're going to buy clothes, what are the sections often called? Men's and women's, right? But again, if the English language was being utilized accurately per the definitions of the words, the sections would be called feminine and masculine, right? And in an awesome store, there might be like no feminine and masculine. It might be based on sizes and colors and body shapes, which would be really great for a lot of us. So gender expression is particularly interesting and important because it's often the most controversial of all of these gender identities, right? Or social identities. So we want to look at two examples that kind of go more in depth with gender expression and explain what is at the root of how gender expression develops and what it means. So if you look at the screen, this first example is a person in America. We don't know how they identify because we don't know them. And this picture was taken around 2010. And so if you surveyed 100 people in America in 2010 and asked them, how do you read this person's gender expression? A majority of people would tell you that they read this person's gender expression as feminine, right? Now we're going to look at a picture of a person in Scotland around 2010. And if you surveyed 100 people in 2010 in Scotland and asked, how do you read this person's gender expression? A majority of them would say that they read their gender expression as masculine, right? So these examples are interesting because you have two individuals, both in 2010, and because they're in different cultures, their gender expression is read differently, even though they're wearing very similar clothing, right? So this is one example of many that we could name of how culture as a variable determines how we read gender expression. So for those of you who have traveled, I'm sure that you've seen examples of this in other countries. In South Asia and India, it's often considered very masculine for men to wear what we would call in America a skirt. That's not what it's called. But, right, so culture is often a variable in what we understand to be masculine or feminine. Now we're going to look at this example. And this is a person in America in 1776. And if you look at the example, you'll notice that it might be kind of hard to see, but there's a good 1.5 inch heel on their shoes. They have stockings on, longer hair. And if you surveyed 100 people in America around 1776, a majority of those people would say that this person's gender expression is very masculine, right? Especially back then, to ride a horse, to get around, you had to have a good heel, right? So gender expression often is related to function as well. This is an example of someone present day in America. So the same variable is the same culture, but a different time. And if you surveyed 100 people in America today, they would say that this person's gender expression is generally feminine, right? So again, looking at these two examples, the constant variable is culture, but the variable that's different is the time, right? So this is an example of how time affects what we read as feminine or masculine. And again, there are so many examples that we can think of. Back in 1776, someone who wanted to be more feminine would never wear pants. But today, someone who wanted to be more feminine could definitely wear pants and be read as feminine, right? So what this draws us to examine is if time and culture make gender expression and expectations of gender expression so fluid, why is it that we are so set on having expectations that boys wear blue, boys like football, boys have a deep voice, girls should like pink, girls wear dresses, girls cook, right? And I can't answer that question for you, but it's a question worth examining because oftentimes, again, this is the most political and upsetting thing to parents. It's not that their child identifies as lesbian or gay, it's that their child is dressing in a way that doesn't fit when they got that baby wrapped in a pink blanket, what they expected them to look like when they were 20, right? So it's an important conversation to have. So last, we're going to talk about sexual orientation, and at the Ruth Ellis Center, we often use the phrase attractional orientation. And that's because we want to encourage people to think about orientation more holistically other than just who people are sexually attracted to. Because thank God the human race has evolved and attraction and orientation is about way more than just who we have sex with. So this is a good thing, right? This is a part of our humanity that intimacy and attraction is also about social interactions. It's about spiritual intimacy. It's about psychological, mental, all of these different levels. So our definition that we use is who an individual is spiritually, emotionally, socially, physically, and sexually attracted to based on their sex, gender, in relation to their own. And words that we use to name this include lesbian, bisexual, bi-attractional, gay, pansexual, heterosexual, asexual, and questioning. And so again, I just want to do a quick visualization activity. And I'm going to ask you that if you're currently partnered, if you're currently dating someone or married, to think about, if you're okay with this, think about that person for this visualization activity. And if you are single, but you have an idea of kind of what someone that you would be attracted to would be like, just kind of imagine this theoretical person. I want you to think about the first time you ever saw this person or the first time you would see this person. You haven't had a conversation with them yet, but if you're just looking at them, what would make you attracted to them? So what are physical traits that make you attracted to a person? When we do this activity, people often say they have to be tall, they have to have dark hair. For some reason, people always say they have to have big hands. I don't know what that means about our attraction. But then I want to ask you to think about the first conversation that you ever had about the person that you're attracted to, or to imagine the first conversation that you would have with the person you're attracted to. And what are things that they would say or do that would make you interested in them? What was something that your partner, your current partner, said or did the first time you ever spoke with them that made you interested? And then think about the first date, or the first time you hung out or spent time together. What were things that you learned about that person in terms of their interests, their values, that made you attracted to them? And then really taking a jump, if you consider yourself to be seriously partnered, for some people that means marriage, for some people that means putting it on Facebook, right? But if you're seriously partnered, or someday you imagine what your partner would be like if you were seriously partnered, what core values, what non-negotiables exist in that attraction that are important to you? A lot of people will say they have to vote a certain way, they have to go to a certain church, they have to respect me, they have to be nonviolent, they have to want kids. A lot of people say they have to have a job, right? But there aren't right or wrong answers, but we really encourage people to think about this and how you can go through this whole reflection on what's important to you in your attraction, and we cannot talk about sex at all. Doesn't mean that people aren't thinking about it, doesn't mean it's not important to people, but again, attraction is so much more holistic than that. And if attraction is that holistic, thinking about the youth that you work with, the people that you work with, understanding that that attraction and that their partner is a part of every facet of their life is an important thing, which means that it's an important thing to ask about, right? So we're going to do an activity now, and I'm going to show you this, and then in a second I'm going to ask for a volunteer to come up. But what we have here are 4 dice that are covered in glitter, right? So this is a visualization activity, and each dice represents one of the 4 different social identities that we just talked about. So one of the dice is a biological sex dice, and it has words that we use to often name biological sex. One of the dice is a gender identity dice, one's a gender expression dice, and one is a sexual orientation dice. So 2 disclaimers about these dice. First of all, there are more than 6 words that exist in the world and in the English language to explain these identities. So these are just the top 6 possibilities. And also, they're not dice to insinuate that your chances of identifying this way are 1 in 6. That's not accurate. So don't think about this mathematically. This is a demonstration for different purposes. So what we want you to note is that all the glitter, and at Ruth Ellis Center, we really love glitter. I'm getting it all over VC's computer. Sorry. So there's thousands of different pieces of glitter on this one example, which is boy man, right? And so what we want you to think about or think of is that each individual in the world is a tiny speck of glitter, right? And so if someone uses the word boy or man to explain their identity, that there are 1,000 different ways that identifying as a boy or a man can look, right? And that it's all on this giant plane, and some of those specks of glitter might be right in the middle of that definition of boy man. Some of them might be kind of on the edge. Microphone might be on the edge towards transgender, right? So there's a lot of different ways to conceptualize identity, but this is one analogy or example that we use. So now I'm going to ask Pat to come up as a volunteer. And what we're going to do is we're going to roll these dice and examine how there are many different combinations of how one's identity can show up. So thank you so much. So we're going to roll 1 dice at a time, and I'm going to ask Pat to share what name of social identity comes up. So what that says, boy, man. So again, looking at this chart on the PowerPoint, boy, man is a word that we would often use to explain gender identity. So we're going to put that there. And if we can roll the next dice, it's kind of like the lottery, right? We have question marks. So questioning is something that we talk about a lot at the Ruth Ellis Center, because sometimes youth come to us and they say, I don't know what word I would use to explain how I identify. And that's a very key part of the work that's important to note, because questioning, first of all, does not mean confused, but questioning is also a healthy part of the human experience, right? So just because someone doesn't have a word to label their identity doesn't mean that they don't know who they are. They're just trying to figure it out, right? A quick example of that really quick would be, growing up, I was doing a project on my ethnicity, and I was at my grandma's house, and I was writing about how I'm American. And my grandma saw the paper and freaked out, was like, "You are not American, you are German American." My grandma's first language was German. I was so embarrassed. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't know this, right? So it wasn't like all of a sudden my identity changed, my body changed from an American to a German American, but I had new language to better identify my ethnicity more accurately. Right? So questioning is an important piece, and we're going to put questioning on gender expression for the purposes of this activity. And let's go ahead and roll the next dice. It says heterosexual. So heterosexual is a word that we often use to explain sexual orientation. And then we'll roll the last dice. Transsexual. So transsexual is a word that we often use to identify biological sex. So if you look at the screen and look at this combination, this is a combination of ways someone might identify that absolutely can exist. Transsexual is a term that we use for biological sex to explain an individual who has gone through some kind or some level of hormone therapy and or gender reassignment surgery. Boy-man is an identity that we're familiar with. Gender expression can be questioning, and orientation can be heterosexual. So it's important to note this example, because just because we know that someone identifies as a boy or man doesn't mean we know what body parts they have, and it doesn't mean that we know what kind of relationship they're interested in being in, right? So let's go ahead and roll each dice again, and we'll do another example. Gender queer. So under gender identity, we're going to put gender queer. And a lot of times people ask about the word queer. Is this a word that's okay to use? I thought that was derogatory, right? We used to play smear the queer when we were little, and that was really mean, right? So what we say for this word is that we wouldn't recommend using the word unless you know the community. And again, you want to take cues from individuals. Is that a word that someone uses to self-identify? And if that's the case, then we would respect that. But queer is a word that often is used in more academic communities as an umbrella term to explain the LGBTQ community. It's not a word that youth at the Ruth Ellis Center use typically, because it's just not something that resonates. And oftentimes, the aging LGBTQ community is still offended by the word, so it's important to respect that and note that. So we'll roll the next dice. Questioning again. So under gender expression, we have questioning again. Next dice, rolls gay. So orientation is gay. And then the last dice, also questioning. So this is an individual that would probably make a lot of folks uncomfortable, but it's not about us, right? Ambiguity makes us uncomfortable, but ambiguity is real. Thank God that life is not so boring that there are always clear answers, right? People often ask, how can you be questioning your biological sex? And again, that's very much related to internal reproductive anatomy, chromosomes, and hormone levels, right? So I don't know if anyone here has ever looked at a map of their chromosomes, or if anyone knows their exact hormone levels in their bodies. Most of us don't, right? So our biological sex might not actually be clearly male or female, and we might not even know that, right? So there are definitely ways or reasons that someone could question their biological sex. Let's do one more quick dice roll and we'll go through these. So we have transgender, feminine, bi. How did it roll?
I can't see it. Questioning.
Questioning, okay. So again, this is another combination of an individual that absolutely could exist. Thank you so much, Pat. Give Pat a hand. So while some of these combinations might be more unique or rare, again, it's important to demonstrate that just because someone looks feminine doesn't mean you know that they identify as a woman, doesn't mean that you know that they identify as gay or straight. Unfortunately, gaydar is a myth. People hate to hear that because they love to think that they can look at a person and know everything about them, but that's not necessarily true. So now we're going to go into talking about some very concrete behaviors and things related to your work as community mental health providers. So up here we have a list of behaviors to avoid that are considered rejecting behaviors of LGBTQ youth. And these are not behaviors that we just made up. These are behaviors that were part of the Family Acceptance Project study. So these are behaviors that were studied as it related to those 4 concrete health outcomes being suicide, HIV, illegal drug use, and depression, right? So what we know is that these are the list of behaviors, and there are a few behaviors we left out because the slide was so crowded, but the behaviors that we left out were physically or verbally abusing your child because of their LGBTQ identity, right? But these are behaviors that concretely relate to increasing a child's risk of experiencing those 4 negative health outcomes. So again, this moves the conversation away from what you believe and moves it towards, here are some concrete behaviors that we're going to ask you to start to avoid or try to reduce, right? So going through these, the first one, excluding LGBTQ youth from family and family activities. And this is something that happens a lot, especially with youth who identify as transgender. We had a family who had a family reunion, and their child had come out as transgender. They were male-bodied, had been raised as a boy, and at age 14 came out and shared that they actually identify as a girl and started wearing more feminine clothing. And the father in particular was very uncomfortable with this and did not want their family from down south knowing that their son identifies as a girl and is now their daughter. And so they didn't explicitly say you're not allowed to come to the family reunion, but they never invited them. They encouraged other activities that were happening that weekend, right? So it's important that we pay attention to these things because they're often not explicit. Families, fortunately, rarely come to us and are saying explicitly anti-gay things, but oftentimes families are doing things that are demonstrating their discomfort or lack of understanding around their child's identity. And as community mental health professionals and case managers and people who work with youth, you've been trained to read between the lines and kind of try to pick up on cues that are going on with the family. So we really encourage you to pay attention to those. Some of the other ones include blocking access to LGBTQ friends, events, resources, blaming your child when they are discriminated against because of their LGBTQ identity. This third one's important to note because we talk about victim blaming a lot with survivors of sexual assault. And so in the same way that we often victim blame people, well, you shouldn't have been wearing a short skirt or else you wouldn't have been treated that way, we do that with LGBTQ youth, right? Well, if you weren't dressing so feminine at school, you wouldn't get picked on by the football team. It's like, well, is that really how we want to frame the conversation? Shouldn't the conversation be the school needs to be a safe space for everybody who's following rules? So if you're following the dress code, even though you identify as a boy, if you're wearing nail polish, if that's allowed for anyone, that should be allowed for you. You should be able to go there and be safe and learn, right? So the conversation's about the football players bullying the child, not how the child is expressing their identity, right? Pressuring your child to be more or less masculine or feminine, we see it all the time. I'm okay that they're gay, but can they just not act so girly, right? We hear this all the time. Telling your child that God will punish them because they are gay, telling your child that you are ashamed of them or that how they look or act will shame the family, making your child keep their LGBT identity a secret in the family and not letting them talk about it. So it's important to note that, especially for this last one, families often do this. My parents did this with me. Please don't tell your grandma, was the first thing that my dad said when I came out to him. And it wasn't because my dad was explicitly anti-gay, and it's often not because parents hate their child for being gay. It's very much related to parents wanting to protect their child, right? Wanting to keep them safe physically, wanting to protect them from ridicule of family members. And so it's important that we pay attention to this and that we affirm parents and we affirm the idea of wanting to keep your child safe. But we need to reframe what that conversation looks like so that the child doesn't hear that as that the parent's trying to save you from yourself, right? So instead of saying, don't come out to grandma, say, I affirm you and love you for who you are. Why don't we sit down and have a conversation about what coming out to grandma would look like? And so what we do is we always do a cost-benefit analysis with youth, and it's important to know as mental health professionals that you can never tell someone that they should or should not come out. It has to be their choice. This is about basic self-determination, which is something that you all know, right? But especially when working with adolescents, it is important that we help them think through the implications of any decision that they make, right? So what we do is we draw a simple cross, make a 4-compartment table, and one of the sides is positive. And we say, well, what are the positive? Let's list the positive things about coming out to grandma. And let's list the positive things about not coming out to grandma. And again, this has to be in their words. It's not in your words. And then let's look at the negative things about coming out to grandma. And let's list the negative things about not coming out to grandma. And that last quadrant is especially important because we have to understand that asking a child to not be themselves has serious mental health outcomes that hurts their quality of life and safety. So that's the conversation we encourage people to have. The rest of the list, going through it, we're now going to look at the flip side of the behaviors. And these are behaviors that help. These are behaviors that we want to encourage families to adopt with their LGBTQ children. And certainly these are behaviors that we are inviting you as professionals that we know are best practices because these behaviors reduce the chances of an LGBTQ child coming to you for mental health services, committing suicide, experiencing depression, using illegal drugs, or contracting HIV. So these behaviors include talking with your child or foster child about their LGBT identity. And when we talk about this one, I actually am going to invite everyone to open up your packet and look at the second to last page in your packet. And it's the Ruth Ellis Center Drop-In Center Intake Form. And so a lot of times providers say, well, I suspect that this child identifies as gay, but I don't know how to ask them about it. Right? And so what we would say as an agency, and what we would hope is that all agencies include questions about sexual orientation and gender identity in your intake so that you are asking every young person who comes in the door, every client who comes in the door about this, in the same way that you ask everyone what their date of birth is, what their social security number is, what their race and ethnicity are, right? This is information that's vital to you providing quality, accurate services. So again, as long as it's confidential and people feel safe sharing this information, making it a part of your intake form is important. So at the bottom, you'll see that we ask about biological sex. And for all of these responses, people can check more than one. And if they ever don't see a word that resonates with how they identify, they can check other and fill in the blank, which is also a very important key. So that's an example of what that can look like. And if you flip the page over at the top, it has the rest of the questions. And we also at the Ruth Ellis Center ask about sexual activity. God forbid. But again, as practitioners, we would say that it is irresponsible to not ask these questions because you are missing opportunities to help young people be safer and healthier if you are not asking these questions, right? So it might feel uncomfortable, but that helps us grow. That means that we're learning, right? And with sexual activity in particular, asking about that separately is extremely important because just because we know a child's or a consumer's sexual orientation does not mean that we know what kind of sex they have had or are having or are interested in having, right? So, second on the list is express affection when your child tells you or when you learn that your child is gay or transgender. Third, require that other family members respect your child's identity. Bring your child to LGBT organizations or events. This is extremely important, and this is why we're going to dedicate time at the end to talk about the Ruth Ellis Center services, because referring youth to services where they can be around people they identify with is about reducing isolation. We meet so many youth when we do school work who think that they're the only gay person in the world. They've never met anybody else who identifies as gay. And this is a huge piece of the anxiety for them, that they feel so other, they feel so different. And so meeting other people that they can relate to, not just in terms of sexual orientation, but also in terms of other social identities, is extremely important. Talk with clergy and help your faith community to support LGBTQ people. Welcome your child's LGBT friends, partners into your home, support your child's gender expression, and believe that your child can have a happy future as an LGBT adult. So again, these are the lists that come from Dr. Ryan's work from the Family Acceptance Project. But now we're going to talk about something in our packet. So we're going to ask people to open your packet to the 4th page from the back, and it's titled The Heterosexual Questionnaire. Looks like this. And so 2 disclaimers before people look at this. First of all, the questionnaire, you're not going to be asked to share any of your answers. This is for your purposes and your reflection. And second, the questionnaire assumes that everyone identifies as heterosexual, and we know that that's not true. So if you don't identify as heterosexual, that's okay. You will not have to out yourself, but you can look through this as a learning tool. So we're going to give you 5 minutes to, again, just read through the questions. There's some on the back, and write your answers, and we'll discuss the questions afterward. So as you've probably gathered, these questions were questions that were compiled by asking people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, what are questions that people ask you that don't make sense, or offensive, or confusing, or seem to indicate double standards? So they took those questions and they took out, what do you think caused you to be gay? And they replaced all the gays and lesbian words with heterosexual or straight, right? So the purpose is that this is a learning tool to help us examine what are some of the assumptions that we make, what are things that we have that we just kind of always assumed or thought about. So just asking here at the live site, does anyone want to shout out a number of a question that they thought was particularly thought-provoking or humorous? Number 7. So number 7 asks, why do you insist on flaunting your heterosexuality? Can't you just be who you are and keep it quiet? So, a lot of people talk about how they have serious issues with PDA. I'm like, you know what, that's fine. If you have issues with PDA, that's fine, but just make sure that you apply that equally, right? So if you're uncomfortable with a man and a woman at a park holding hands, then you might also be uncomfortable with seeing 2 men holding hands at a park. But saying that you're comfortable with the man and woman holding hands, but you're not comfortable with the man and man holding hands, kind of is an interesting double standard, right? So we just want to unpack that and understand that. And then in terms of flaunting identity, this is something that I think folks who identify as LGBTQ laugh at, because really the standard is that you are straight. Everyone assumes you're straight unless you say otherwise. A majority of images in media portray straight couples. People indicate that they're straight often by having wedding rings or having big ceremonies and drawing attention to that. And we're not saying that people shouldn't do that. That's a healthy part of expressing an important piece of your life. But again, examining who do we allow that privilege to and who do we not, and what does that mean? So other numbers. Number 9, why do heterosexuals try to recruit others into their lifestyle? I can tell you how many times my grandma has asked me when I'm getting married, when I'm bringing a boy home, why don't I have a boyfriend? It's just exhausting, right? The expectation has always been that I will be straight, that I will marry a man. Everyone around me, I have a lot of friends that's what they're doing, that's what they assume I'm doing unless I indicate otherwise. So we certainly can make the argument that we are expecting or recruiting young people to identify as straight, but obviously we want to just push back and say that again, we want to support anyone having a healthy and safe relationship, right? Other numbers. Number 10 reads, a disproportionate majority of child molesters are heterosexual. Do you consider it safe to expose children to heterosexual teachers? This is really important, right? Because it's actually accurate. So a majority of people who perpetrate crimes against children related to sex crimes do identify as straight. right? But we have never once said we don't feel straight with straight people being teachers. So a lot of this is about just getting accurate information. There's a lot of misinformation out there that insinuates that because someone's gay, they're more likely to molest children, and that is not true. So why should someone's job be in jeopardy as a teacher, as a counselor, because of how they identify, right? As long as they're, again, being safe and healthy, then providing quality services, their ability to do so should not be questioned based on their sexual orientation, but on their CRC or criminal background check. 17. So 17 on the back reads, have you considered trying aversion therapy? So for folks who identify as straight, have you ever considered going to therapy to see if you actually should be gay, right? To try to become gay? No, obviously not. So certainly, the state of California has actually outlawed aversion therapy, which is the practice of sending people who identify as LGBTQ, and actually in California more specifically, they outlawed sending minors. So a minor saying, that we shouldn't be sending children who cannot consent or make that decision for themselves to therapy that tries to turn them straight. A lot of research demonstrates that practice has been extremely detrimental and again has increased the child's chances of committing suicide, experiencing depression, contracting HIV, and using illegal drugs. Number 2, very simply, number 2 asks, when and where did you decide you were heterosexual? And most people kind of ponder the question for a second and maybe I can name this, but for the most part, people just say, no, this is what I've always understood or named because it's what society has expected of me and it's what's comfortable and helps me feel like myself. So it's something I've just always understood, right? Let's take one more number. 14 reads on the back, considering the menace of overpopulation, how could the human race survive if everyone were heterosexual? Wow, what a great question that applies to foster care and adoption as well, right? But this is an important question of how do we think about bigger issues? How do we think about children? We know that within foster care that same-sex couples, same-gender couples can foster children together. But as it stands right now in the state of Michigan, because same-sex marriage is not legal, 2 parents cannot both adopt the child. So a child might grow up with 2 moms or 2 dads, but only one of those parents can legally be the adoptive parent, right? So God forbid something happens to the adoptive parent and they pass away, the other parent that the child grew up with and has always known that they have an attachment to, legally has no rights to them and can be taken from them. So again, regardless of what you believe, this is about the health and safety of children. If we understand as counselors that attachment's important and that health and safety is important, then we really want to be thinking about how does supporting these issues equal best practice as a profession. So if we look up at the screen here, there is a slide about heterosexism versus homophobia. So homophobia is a word that people use a lot to describe anti-gay behavior. But we mention this because we want people to be thinking about what the implications are of our language sometimes and the bigger picture. So I don't know if there are a ton of macro thinkers in here if you're all clinical, but thinking back to any of the macro coursework that you were forced to do as a clinician and thinking about isms, that's what this relates to. So homophobia, while it's a term that captures some parts of discrimination, it really only captures a tiny piece of it, because it quite literally is talking about a fear. Phobia is a fear, right? So when we say homophobia, that means fear of a homosexual. And while there are certainly folks that are actually quite literally scared of gay people, what we're talking about is way bigger than that. So we use heterosexism because when we talk about an ism, we're talking about not just the fear, but the systematic oppression that exists. So who can give me an example of another ism that exists in society? Racism, right? We don't call racism people of color phobia, right? We call it racism. We don't call sexism women phobia, right? Yes, people are scared of folks that maybe don't identify the same way, but what an ism captures is how systematic the discrimination is, right? That this is about more than just interpersonal discrimination or prejudice. It's about historic and current realities that block people's access to safety and health and other rights that people have. So we use heterosexism, and the working definition of that is the intrapersonal, which is internal, interpersonal, which is between people, and institutional, meaning systematic, laws, policies, culture. And these are the ways that people who identify as straight discriminate against people who identify as LGBT. So again, this is important to consider this holistic definition, even as clinicians, because this affects your youth. In the state of Michigan, there are 2 institutionalized ways that we maintain heterosexism. And we hear about marriage a lot, but I'm not talking about marriage. Does anyone have any guesses as to what those 2 policies in the state of Michigan are that maintain heterosexism? They're related to 2 basic things that you work with your clients on probably every week. 2 basic needs: housing and employment, right? So in the state of Michigan, it is legal for an employer to say, we don't hire gay people, or we fired that person because we found out she was a lesbian. And that is completely legal in the state of Michigan right now. So if you're working with an LGBTQ person who's looking for a job and you don't know that, that's an extremely problematic situation, right? And then the same goes for housing. So unless it's HUD-funded housing, because the feds have said that we don't want to discriminate against LGBTQ folks, unless it's HUD-funded, if it's a private apartment owner, they could put a sign in their apartments that say, apartments for rent except for gays. And that would be totally legal in the state of Michigan, right? So when we talk about policies, again, this isn't about what you believe on a personal level or politics. This is about safety and health and people having access to that. So it's definitely an important thing to know. So I'll go through these slides just briefly, but if you want to look at these, they're 2 back from the heterosexism slide. But they are 2 slides just noting some very brief ways that you as a practitioner can leave, and these are some things you can leave doing today differently to better affirm LGBTQ youth that you serve, LGBTQ people that you serve. So the first is just a note about language. So using terminology such as partner or person you are dating instead of gender-specific titles such as girlfriend or husband. So you can say, and it's kind of, I've always thought it's kind of strange when adults use girlfriend and boyfriend anyways, because I'm like, are you dating a child? Like, what's going on, right? So this is a way that we can adapt identifying our partner without identifying our heterosexual privilege, right? So you can say, the person I'm dating is coming to the wedding with me. My partner and I are going to move in together. And then obviously at some point you might indicate that it's a he or a she or their name, but doing this does a lot for LGBTQ folks. It demonstrates your allyship, and it can help, especially youth that you work with. That's a cue that you're a safe person, right? Second, don't assume that someone wants to or legally can get married. A lot of times we'll ask you, like young adults, are you going to get married? And whenever my grandma asks that, I'm like, Grandma doesn't know that I'm not allowed to get married right now. Third, know that just because a youth's identification or paperwork says male or female doesn't mean that you know if they identify as a boy or a girl or transgender. So all the time we get paperwork before young people come to us, right, off the fax machine. Does anyone else still fax stuff? Why do we still fax stuff? It's so funny. Anyways, so you have this giant packet of grainy intake material that you're trying to read, and you see male or female. And again, not because you're a bad person, but because you're a human, you make all these assumptions about what that child's going to look like who's going to come to you for services. So we encourage you to check that and make sure that you're not making those assumptions just because you have that one piece of information. And then finally, do not assume an individual's gender pronouns. So model introducing yourself, followed by sharing the gender pronouns that you use. And at Ruth Ellis Center, we do this all the time. My name is Jessie, and I use she and her gender pronouns. My colleague says, my name is Henry, I use he and him gender pronouns. And a lot of people say, well, this is I don't like it, it's weird, it's different, I have to explain what I'm doing. And I would say people explain stuff all the time that's not nearly as important, We explain how to text that picture of a cat dancing. We explain how to play this new game on your phone. So why can't you briefly mention or explain your gender identity when that is very much related to respecting individuals and very much related to issues of safety, right? And not making assumptions. So we'd really encourage people to take that practice on. And then some long-term agency program goals. Changing your intakes to include these pieces of gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, biological sex. Looking at your policies to develop enumerated directives, and doing an audit of your space. How can you, in your office, your waiting room, in terms of the pamphlets that you have, include resources for people who identify as LGBTQ, and not just LGBTQ, but also that intersect with other identities that you serve. So youth, people of color, materials that are accessible in terms of literacy level, making sure the language is in the language that your community speaks, so that, again, that's a small cue that people can feel safe at your agency. Because they're coming to you all for a reason. They see you as a resource. So to be a resource for everybody is extremely important. So we're going to watch a video now of services at Ruth Ellis Center so that you will have a visual of what our space looks like. And this is a program that our youth in foster care went through, but if you work with youth in foster care, you know that you cannot ever get a media release for those folks, right? So none of the youth who are in care with us are in this video, but they participated in this program. And this is a brief video on a section of our summer internship. So we have a summer internship that runs, and 20 LGBTQ youth of color are employed for the summer, and they're there to learn about LGBTQ African American history. They do cooking classes, financial literacy, emotional literacy, professionalism. They do field trips around Detroit. They do a meditation course as a tool to address trauma. So it's a really intensive program, but this was a project that they did as a part of that last year related to creating a fashion show. So you're going to see the process that they went through to put on a fashion show that happened at our annual event for the Ruth Ellis Center. And just a reminder that most of these youth identify as LGBTQ. Most of them, when they feel like they're really being their authentic selves, often have gender expression that does not fit what society would expect them to do. So the point of the fashion show was to affirm gender expression that really supported the youth's identity. So that was our annual event last year, and it's something that we're very proud of, not just because annual events are normally boring and just include dinner and a lot of people who have a lot of money speaking, but that's, it's a youth-driven event, right? It's an activity that has really been determined and crafted by the youth. But for that event in particular, these are youth, most of whom identify as transgender, who their whole lives have not only been told that who they are is not okay. Many of the youth, because we did a lot of pre and post reflection around this activity, talked about experiences of physical violence at the hands of their primary caregivers when they attempted to be themselves, right? So one of the young men talked about, as a child, trying on heels in his mom's room and his dad finding him and beating him so badly that his mom had to take him to his grandma's for a few days because she was worried about his safety, right? So when being yourself is dangerous, we have a lot to talk about, right? And so for the youth to have a moment where they're being themselves is celebrated and affirmed, that's a hugely transformative piece of the work. And we talk about doing that at Ruth Ellis Center, but a takeaway of this presentation is that certainly if you work with LGBTQ youth, we would encourage you to refer them for services that we're going to talk about in a second, but also to know that you have the ability to be an affirming, caring adult in this person's life. That you have the social work tools, that you are a resource for these youth in so many other ways, that this can just be one more reason that they come to you and trust you and see you as a support. So talking about the Ruth Ellis Center services, if you have youth that you work with who are in foster care at this time, this would be a resource that's important to know about. So we have a residential foster care home that's a home-like environment in the North End neighborhood in Detroit. And it's a licensed 5-bed facility for youth ages 12 to 17. And the youth who come to us to live there are permanent or temporary wards of the state. And the house specializes in working with LGBTQ youth, but is not exclusive to LGBTQ youth. And this is something that we talk about as a resource, but also I just want to note is something that as Detroiters we should be extremely proud of, because there are no other residential foster care facilities in the country that specialize in working with LGBTQ youth. We are the only one in the entire country. A lot of people have ideas about what can and cannot happen in Detroit, and I think this is a great example of the potential and the strengths of a community that has been through a lot, but is only coming out stronger and supporting people and looking out for people more so because of that. So there are other residential foster care placements that do a good job working with LGBTQ youth, and we affirm that and support that. We're not saying send all the gay kids to us because we can't handle that, right? There are youth who are going to want to stay with you all in placement because you've been a support and an attachment for them throughout their life so far, but we just encourage you to think about resources for them. Our second main program is our community mental health services. We are under CareLink, so we can serve folks who live in Wayne County through Medicaid dollars, and we do individual, group, and family counseling for people ages 7 to 30. And the family work in this piece is especially important because families are often experiencing what we call ambiguous loss when their child comes out, right? So when there's a death in the family, that's a very clear loss, right? If you move, that's a very clear transition. But when a child comes out, what often is happening for parents is that they're feeling confused about it. They're having to recognize and grieve who they thought their child was, who they expected their child to be. And so it's important that you honor those endings before moving into helping the parents understand the celebrations and the potential and the strength and the excitement of now being able to be even closer to your child as they get to be themselves with you. So that's a huge piece of the work. It can be a really difficult piece of the work. Meeting parents where they are when they are exhibiting a lot of rejecting behaviors can be difficult, but it's extremely important because we know in this work that family preservation, family reunification is key. So we cannot work with just the youth. We have to work with the whole family. And finally, a service or other umbrella service is our drop-in center. And this is a service, if you work with a young person who already has a placement, already has a counselor that they're happy with and feel affirmed by, this would be where you'd want to connect them. The drop-in center is low barrier entry. It doesn't require a referral, doesn't require paperwork. It's really just walk in. As long as a young person is between the ages of 13 and 24, they're able to come to this space. They also don't have to identify as LGBTQ. So we're open Mondays and Wednesdays, 3 to 9, and Thursdays, 3 to 7 in Highland Park. And we have a lot of different programming that runs out of this facility. We have a retreat for women who identify as transgender and African American. We have our summer internship program that was featured in the video. We have our peer-facilitated support groups, and those run 3 times a week. And we have ballet, and the ballet that happens in this space is all African-centric. So our teacher, Adashella, danced with Dance Theater of Harlem and Alvin Ailey. So again, it's not just talking about affirming that if you are a boy doesn't mean you can't do ballet. And in addition to that, we're gonna look at how ballet has been really Eurocentric and kind of oppressive, and look at a different way of doing ballet that's more African-centric and inclusive. We also have art therapy, meditation, cooking class, tutoring, case management, and final program is youth leadership and advocacy. And that piece is very key. I could do a whole nother presentation on that piece of our work, but it's very essential to our space that we don't just have direct services in our space, but that we also have advocacy work that's happening. So we want to leave some time for questions. We have 9 minutes, but this is our basic contact information. Again, my name is Jessie Fullenkamp. If you have questions that you want to ask more specifically that we don't have time for, you don't feel comfortable asking, please feel free to use me as a resource. My email is jessie.fullenkamp@ruthelliscenter.org, or you can just call us and find me. But again, before we get to questions, the last takeaway of this, again, is that we want you to refer youth, but we also want you to know that you already have the tools and resources to provide quality services to affirm LGBTQ children. It's just about, in our busy day, remembering that this work is too important to do things that we know don't work. We need to look at best practices. We need to be strategic because we have such a little amount of time with youth every week. We really want to maximize that and provide quality services. And that's what the system of care is about. So why don't we go ahead and start with some questions?
Thank you, Jesse. And before we collect questions, I did want to remind everybody one more time to please fill out your electronic survey as soon as you're able. We're going to check in with Children's Center and see if you have any questions to open the question section.
No questions here, Pat.
All right, we'll go to LBS. Any questions there, Laura?
Yes, under the gender identifying language, what does the term fluid mean?
Yeah, so fluid, excellent question. Fluid is a term that some people use to talk about gender identity not fitting into a box. So fluid might mean that you don't feel like just saying woman or man or transgender really fit who you are, how you identify. So some people might say fluid as a way to try to build a narrative around all of those aspects of their identity. If you think about, I think an easier way to understand fluid too is to think about other languages and how in other languages we name gender identity differently. So in a lot of languages in Southeast Asia, instead of just having 2 pronoun options, there are 5 that are part of the regular language of the community. It's not like something that just happens in queer spaces. It's a part of the regular language. And then in other communities, in Ghana, for example, in Tree, there aren't 2 options. It's not he and she, it's just wo. And that's the gender pronoun that you use to describe anybody. So you say, wo is going to the store, and you don't know if that person identifies as he or she or as a man or a woman. So there's a lot of different ways to conceptualize gender identity based on language, based on culture. So we'd highly encourage folks to just respect that, and fluidity in the English language is one way to explain that.
Thank you. Next, we'll check in with Community Living Services. Any questions there?
Yeah, we have 2 questions, but I'll start with the first. Could you further explain gender queer and pansexual?
Yeah, good question. Genderqueer, again, is not so different than fluid. It might just be another way to say that, but again, explaining or addressing the idea that there isn't one clear label that you identify with, so genderqueer is more comprehensive. Pansexual is a term to describe sexual orientation that does not subscribe to the gender binary. So if someone says bisexual, bi means 2, right? And that's saying that you're attracted to women and men. If you say pansexual, that's recognizing that gender identity is not binary, so you might recognize that you're attracted to women, men, and people who are transgender. So that's a part of the definition of pansexual. And also people who identify as pansexual also speak to often the idea that attraction is about more than just what body parts somebody has. So it's looking at the holistic nature of attraction.
Thank you, Jesse. We'll take our last question from Children's Center.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you describe what is androgynous?
Androgynous was one of the words listed under gender expression. So androgynous is a term that's used to describe gender expression that's not clearly masculine or not clearly feminine. So it might be more in the middle. It's not the best way to describe, right? But so, there's an entire skit that Saturday Night Live had based on this, right, called Pat. And there was this person in the office who had androgynous gender expression, and the whole crux of the joke was that everybody in the office was so off-put by not being able to know more about this person because their gender expression was androgynous, right? And so I think that it just points out that people really like to be able to look at someone and think they know everything about them. But the takeaway is that even if you think you know something about somebody based on how they look, you don't. So best practice, especially as community mental health workers, is to not make assumptions.
Thank you, Jesse. And on behalf of the Detroit Wayne Mental Health Association Authority, I want to thank you so much for coming out to share with us today.
Thank you.